Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for developmental psychology. In this lecture, we'll be talking about socio-emotional development in adolescence. So let's get right into this. So first, let's look at the self in adolescence. So we'll start with self-concepts and self-conceptions in adolescence. So compared to children, so you'll recall we talked about children's self-concept before and how it's very physical. There's a little bit going on with the psychological side, but it's much more physical and concrete. Well, in adolescence, it becomes much less physical and much more psychological. It's not just a little bit less. It's the traits people describe themselves as are pretty much the psychological and the abstract. There's a much more differentiated self-concept. So you ask a bunch of elementary schoolers to describe themselves, and you're going to get a lot of repeats over and over and over again. In adolescence, there's much more variety, as well as it tends to be more integrated and coherent. So when children talk about themselves, they're going to be all over the place. They're going to be talking about their home, they're going to be talking about their dog, they're going to be talking about their friends, their school. In adolescence, it becomes much more smoothed over and integrated from one part of their life or one part of their description to another. In addition to that, it's more self-aware and reflective. It becomes more about the internal self and about who they are rather than just what describes them. So transitioning into self-esteem. So there is some changes that occur. From childhood to early adolescence, self-esteem actually tends to decrease. And this goes back to some of the things we talked about before, about things like the puberty and the changes with puberty. So this transition from middle or junior high school, transition to that, from elementary school that can change some things, transitioning into high school, the physical changes that come along with puberty, the social context and the social comparisons that exist. All of these together result in a tending to decrease slightly of self-esteem. And again, this is mostly due to these changes. And now, instead of comparing themselves just to hypotheticals or to comparing, not even really comparing themselves, they are now comparing themselves to their peers. So there's a lot here that can result in this. But it doesn't mean everyone's self-esteem lowers. As adults, the adolescents who have the lowest self-esteem tend to have poorer physical and mental health. They tend to have poorer career and financial prospects. They tend to have higher levels of criminal behavior than those with higher self-esteem. So even if in general self-esteem tends to decrease, it doesn't decrease for everyone, and in some, self-esteem remains high in adolescence. This usually is to do with things like having a good family, a good education structure in your family, a good parents who care and train or teach their children. Relating to all of this is Erikson's identity stages. So Erikson's identity stages, so if you'll recall from before, we talked about the different theories. One of them we talked about was Erikson's theory of the changes that occur throughout the lifespan, and I said one of these changes is one that has a lot of evidence for it, has a lot of support, and that is the one of identity. Identity versus conflict of identity versus role confusion. So in this one, it's where adolescents are basically forming what makes them up. So there's a lot of different components to identity. There's things like career. So career identity is part of it. Religious identity, moral identity, political identity, sexual identity. Just generally, how do I fit into the world? What do I want out of my life? These are all different components of identity. And it should be pointed out that identity isn't just one thing. And you can be at different stages of identity with different things, with different components. Well, we didn't even talk about it here, but things like racial identity, cultural identity. So you can be at the different stages of identity formation with these different components of identity. Some of them you may figure out, some of them you may never figure out, some of them you may be working on until you're later. Some of these forms of identity you may figure out, and then 10 years later find out that what you figured out isn't really who you are, and you go through this identity challenge or identity crisis again. Let's watch a video.
Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany, and today we're going to be talking about Marcia's states of adolescent identity development. Adolescents today are faced with an incredible amount of stress. They need to make life decisions during a time in their life when they have yet to fully develop their own identity. They're being required to not only answer the question, who am I, but also why am I? Past theories have suggested that adolescents' identity development is driven in part by a need to matter to others in life, in addition to more self-focused motives. One critical aspect of identity development is vocational identity, or young people's answer to the question, what do I want to be when I grow up? Erikson proposed that most people achieve a sense of identity by the end of adolescence, but more recent evidence suggests that even by the high school years, only a small minority of students have begun to think seriously about the eventual role that they will play in society and to identify lifelong goals. Most adolescents need time to consider their options and explore their possibilities. Marcia redefined Erikson's notions by concentrating on cognitive behavioral markers of the identity formation process. Exploration of various alternatives and the decision to commit to one of the available possibilities emerged as a fundamental marker that Marcia identified as a critical component or phase of establishing one's identity. Marcia has identified 4 specific states or patterns of behavior that may characterize the status of an adolescent's search for identity. The first is identification diffusion. The adolescent has made no commitment to a particular career path or ideological belief system. Some haphazard experimentation with particular roles or beliefs may have taken place, but the individual has not yet embarked on a serious exploration of issues related to self-definition. The second state is foreclosure. The adolescent has made a firm commitment to an occupation, a particular set of beliefs, or both. The choices have been based largely on what others, especially parents, have prescribed, without an earnest exploration of other possibilities. The third state is moratorium. The adolescent has no strong commitment to a career or particular set of beliefs, but is actively exploring and considering a variety of professions and ideological beliefs. In essence, the individual is undergoing an identity crisis. The fourth state is identity achievement. The adolescent has previously gone through a period of moratorium and emerged with a commitment to a particular political or religious belief, a clear choice of occupation, or both. The ideal situation is to proceed through a period of moratorium, a period of searching and experimentation that may continue into early adulthood, before finally settling on a clear identity. Foreclosure, identity choice without prior exploration, rules out potentially more productive alternatives. And identity diffusion leaves young people without a clear sense of direction in life. Marcia's encompassing belief of psychological identity development is based on 4 identity statuses and their interpretations of exploration and commitment. Researchers have retrofitted Marcia's contributions so that they're more suitable for potential social networking site research. Through implementing 3 identity processes, commitment, in-depth exploration, and reconsideration of commitment, researchers identified a 5th identity, searching moratorium. During this additional status, adolescents experience both positive and negative characteristics, a 2-faceted moratorium state that alters their developmental progress. It has been concluded that by implementing a tri-identity process schema, a 5th identity status emerged as well as a period of reconsideration for one's commitment. This prolonged period of contemplation provides an opportunity for adolescents to reflect upon and/or revise their identities. Media use, especially Facebook, provides an important backdrop for the social, emotional, and cognitive development of youth through self-evaluation during a prolonged period of reflection. Through social networking sites, adolescents are able to engage in behaviors that contribute to identity development in ways that were previously inconceivable. Traditional identity claims have largely been offline or in person, in environments where deviation from the established social norms was unacceptable. This results in the suppression of one's true self, which ultimately hinders identity development in the public sphere and consequently jeopardizes a sincere claim and its subsequent cognizant placement and acceptance. Earlier online chat room environments enabled the revealing of true selves. However, these proclamations were restricted to blind online communities and had little transfer to authentic situations.
Created using Powtoon.
Okay, it just cuts off there at the end, but she went over the things relevant. Let's look at those. Okay, first, adolescence, and I use the word adolescence here loosely because this applies even to adults. And the video talked adolescence over and over and over again, but really this applies to not just adolescents, but those in their 20s and even older. So adolescents, they're classified into one of four identity statuses for each component of their identity based upon their progress towards forming that identity. The key questions are whether the individual has experienced a crisis or seriously grappled with identity issues, and whether the individual has achieved commitment with their identity in that domain. So there was these four statuses. So this is an example. Good to give an example again, but now we're going to give an example with religion. So someone's religious identity. In the top one. In the top one, we've got no crisis experience. There's never been if you want to call it a crisis of faith, or even anything that's not even necessarily a crisis of faith, but any reason to question your beliefs as they stand. And your beliefs as they stand, basically, when you're a child, is the beliefs you were raised with. And then whether you question them is the crisis. No commitment made is going to be diffusion. We're not yet thought about the issue, so I haven't even really thought much about religion, and I guess I don't know what I believe exactly. So there's been no challenge, there's been no commitment. How about no challenge with commitment? That's foreclosure. So this is where someone basically just follows along and commits to what they've done all along. There is no real thought going into it. My parents are Baptists and I'm a Baptist. It's the way I grew up. And it doesn't even necessarily be with how you grew up. It could be just what you end up doing without even really thinking about it. But then there is that crisis or challenge. And moratorium is when no commitment's made. This is when someone's still thinking about it. So I'm in the middle of evaluating my beliefs and hope that I'll be able to figure out what's right for me. I've become skeptical about some of what I've been taught, and I'm looking into other faiths for answers. Then finally, you have identity achievement status. This is where you've experienced a crisis or a challenge or thought about it deeply and made a commitment. And this is where I really did some soul searching about my religion and other religions too, and I finally know what to believe and what I don't. And the thing that should be pointed out is identity achievement doesn't mean something has to change. It could be the person would end up in foreclosure and identity achievement both as the same identity. So if we're talking religion, they could have the same religious beliefs either way. The point is in foreclosure, they've never really thought about it. In moratorium, they've analyzed it and thought about it. So that is the big difference between them. And as the video said, there's now searching moratorium, which is where you're basically if you've already got identity achievement, you're going back into moratorium to figure out more. And one thing that should be considered is our identities that we form are not necessarily for the rest of your life. You can have another crisis. You can have another challenge to your identity, and you can change your identity from that. So it's just something to be aware of. As long as we're talking about identity, we should talk about ethnic identity. So ethnic identity is where those who have a ethnicity, whatever it is, basically incorporate that identity into, or that ethnicity, into their identity. They don't necessarily have to incorporate it, but again, it's where someone, let's say that they're a certain ethnicity, that's where they think about it and maybe incorporate things from the culture of that ethnicity, some of the culture traditions, maybe not. That is up to the individual. There is no right or wrong answer here. But an ethnic identity is where that we're basically thinking about the identity, the challenge of identity, the analysis of identity results in identity formation. So, forging a sense of identity involves 5 factors. It's really strongly influenced by 5 factors. It's influenced by cognitive growth. So during adolescence, cognitive growth is occurring, and this cognitive growth is allowing the adolescent to think more about themselves and who they are. Personality. So the personality is becoming more solidified in adolescence, and personality shapes this identity formation. Relationship with the parents shapes it. People who have better relationships with their parents tend to, good relationships with their parents tend to have positive challenges to identity. Those who have weak relationships with their parents, but they're okay, not bad, tend to reach foreclosure more often. They don't have the challenges. Those who have difficult relationships with their parents, they will sometimes reach foreclosure without a challenge, or they're much more likely to have strong challenges, so great changes. Opportunities to explore is important for identity development, as well as the broader cultural context. In some cultures, it's not accepted or open to explore certain components of your identity. The next thing we're going to talk about is gender roles and sexuality. Well, your sexual identity is a component of your identity. In some cultures, that isn't allowed. In some cultures, it's more open and accepted. We look at the US now, and it's becoming more and more open and accepted. Things like trans are becoming more open, more accepted. So allowing for identity growth in those domains is becoming more, or I should say adolescents are having more opportunities for that. Let's transition into gender roles and sexuality. So we're going to look at sex and gender, we're going to look at androgyny, we're going to look at theories of gender, we're going to look at gender throughout the lifespan, and we'll finish up with sexual orientation, but first we're going to watch a fairly long video.
People have been having sex and writing songs about it and carving statues of it and changing fashion for it since the dawn of humanity. But it wasn't until fairly recently, the 1940s, that serious Western scientific study of sex began, and by most accounts, you can thank one guy for that: Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was born in 1894 in New Jersey to poor, strict Methodist parents. He studied entomology in college, graduating with degrees in biology and psychology before heading to Harvard. His doctoral thesis was on the genealogy of gall wasps, a subject he tackled with intensity, meticulously collecting over 5 million samples, measuring hundreds of thousands of specimens. And wasps are interesting and everything, but Kinsey's interests drifted toward human sexuality, and his research at Indiana University paved the way for decades of study into sex. He surveyed thousands of men and women about their sexual habits and histories, and found all sorts of interesting things related to sexual preferences, masturbation, orgasms, and premarital sex. He established the Kinsey scale, indicating degrees of sexual orientation, and went on to write the seminal text on sexual behavior in the human male and female, respectively. Like many of the first researchers of human behavior, Kinsey and his colleagues were, and in some ways still are, pretty controversial. But he definitely succeeded in 2 very important tasks. 1, he was an early adopter of a scientific approach to studying sex, and 2, he showed that the popular perception of what people do and don't do sexually versus what people actually do and feel was often very different. Since then, we've seen innumerable sex-related studies examining the physiological, psychological, and social elements of sex. And, there's a whole lot of lingering misinformation and judgy morality swirling around the subject of sex. It can be a tricky topic for sure, but we are here to clear some things up. It's the entire purpose of life, so there's no reason to blush. So, sex. That one little word has complicated so many lives. The desire for or lack of sex has spawned poetry and made babies and transmitted diseases and cost money and driven people batty and kept late-night cable and business. Even the word itself can mean many different things. First, we got the verb kind of sex, the physical process of engaging in sexual acts and intercourse, which probably I don't need to describe to you. Then we've got the biological definition having to do with anatomical parts that go with the designations of male or female or intersex, those who are born with reproductive parts that don't fall into predominant definitions of male or female. And these are quite separate from gender, or an individual's sense of identifying as male or female or another gender identity, regardless of how that corresponds with their actual reproductive plumbing. For transgender people, for instance, gender identity typically doesn't match biological sex. And remember that gender identity is completely different from sexual orientation, which we'll talk about in a minute. So beyond definitions, we've got the physiological and the psychological aspects of sex. Let's start out with the physiological, and with that, Masters and Johnson. In the late 1950s and 60s, American gynecologist William Masters and his collaborator and future wife, sexologist Virginia Johnson, did something no researcher had ever done before. They invited nearly 700 male and female volunteers, many of whom were sex workers, to come into their lab and get it on, either alone or with their partners. Their aim? To record the body's physiological response to sex. This involved wearing a whole lot of wires and heart monitors and such, and it was probably about as sexy as it sounds. All the volunteers had to be willing and able to show arousal and capable of orgasm, and over the years, Masters and Johnson recorded more than 10,000 sexual cycles. The main thing they documented was that a complete sexual response cycle involved 4 distinct stages: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution, which Masters and Johnson maintained happen in a linear way, one after the other. In the excitement phase, things are getting going, blood is rushing to all of the necessary places, genital areas are becoming engorged and secreting lubricant. Next comes the plateau phase. Pulse, blood pressure, and breathing rates keep increasing, and genitals are becoming fully engorged. The penis is often secreting pre-ejaculate as vaginal secretions increase until the big event, orgasm, during which muscles all over the body contract and breathing and pulse rates hit their peak. Of course, a biological male orgasm typically releases sperm that may lead to fertilization, depending on the situation, but female arousal and orgasm also help facilitate conception, again, depending on the situation, as those muscle contractions and lubrication help draw up and retain sperm in the uterus. Finally, the body comes back down to its normal state of affairs during the resolution phase. It's during this phase that biosex males enter a refractory period during which they're unable to orgasm again for a few minutes to a day or more, whereas a biological female's refractory period is very short in comparison. While the 4-stage model of sexual response is still taught today, some have criticized both its rigid linear setup, arguing that things don't always work so tidily in the bedroom, and its insistence on including orgasm, which doesn't happen for everyone all the time. Others also question the model's clinical focus on only physiological factors, arguing that cultural attitudes, psychological and relationship factors, and other external details should also be considered when looking at sexual response. I'll get back to that in a minute, but before we move on to the psychology of sex, we gotta talk about hormones. You remember hormones, those chemical messengers brewed up by the endocrine system that travel through the bloodstream and regulate all sorts of physiological and behavioral activities, from growth to digestion to sleep to sex. Our sex hormones serve 2 major purposes. 1, they direct the physical development of biological sex characteristics, and 2, they help activate sexual behavior. Estrogens, like estradiol, contribute to female sex characteristics and are secreted in greater amounts by females than males. And while all humans make testosterone, it's the predominant sex hormone for males, stimulating the growth and development of male sex characteristics. Now, most female mammals become sexually receptive when their estrogens peak during ovulation, but it doesn't really work that way for humans. Our hormones are more loosely related to sexual behavior, although studies have found that in general, female sexual desire spikes slightly around ovulation when women are most fertile, and males can also be affected by this spike, responding with higher levels of testosterone when ovulating women are around. But these short-term changes hardly compare to the larger, more major hormonal shifts that occur throughout a lifetime. Puberty, for one, tends to get everyone a lot more hot and bothered and interested in dating and gazing at posters of their favorite celebrity crushes, and later in life, as sex hormone production naturally decreases, our amorous urges and endeavors tend to decrease as well, age affects our libido. But in the end, you might think of sex hormones as fuel for your sexual engine. And while an engine can't run on a totally empty tank, it also won't run any better or worse on a full tank versus a half tank. We need our sex hormones, but we also need the right psychological stimuli to turn us on and keep us going sexually. So, finally, let's look at some of these psychological aspects of sex. First, there are the very important social and cultural influences. Things like your families, your societies, your religions, and your personal values. Does your community view sex merely as the means for reproduction, or can it be fun too? What are the views on premarital sex and homosexuality, showing some skin or kissing in public? Then there are the influences of external stimuli. In Western society, we're constantly bombarded with sexually charged content, from movies and TV to advertisements, R&B slow jams, and Victoria's Secret catalogs, and constantly looking at images of things that you find extremely attractive can lead to folks viewing more average people, even their own partners, as being less attractive. But our sexual desire is also fueled by internal stimuli, our imaginations and memories and fantasies. According to plenty of studies, at least 95% of people fantasize about sex at some point. The thing you gotta keep in mind is that none of these factors work independently of each other. How we respond to both external and internal stimuli can be really heavily influenced by social and cultural factors, and that is where a lot of the thinking and studying of sex has gotten really complicated. Human judgment and morality is often entangled with sex and desire, and sadly, a lot of people have been made to feel miserable for liking certain things or being attracted to certain people. There's also just been a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, for ages, a lot of folks believe that masturbation could make you go blind, become mentally ill, or kill the neighborhood kittens. It doesn't do that. And as I know you're thinking right now, one area of sexuality that's been needlessly associated with conflict, fear, and shame in many cultures is sexual orientation. For our purposes, sexual orientation can be defined as a relatively enduring physical or romantic attraction to another person. Heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual are all types of sexual orientation, and although the field once stigmatized non-heterosexual orientations, we now know that homosexuality and bisexuality are in no way related to mental health. Psychologists are also beginning to look more in depth at other sexual orientations. For instance, asexuality or non-sexuality, where no sexual attraction of any kind is experienced. In any case, whether a culture itself is friendly to or tyrannical against any of these orientations, all types prevail. Sexual orientation is neither chosen nor changed. So, what might cause these differences? Hopefully you already know this, but it's worth repeating. There's no evidence that sexual orientation is determined by things like a dominating mother or a passive father, or sex hormone levels in your adult body, or your history of childhood abuse, or whether your parents were gay or straight. In other words, decades of research have led most researchers to believe that once you're born, there are no clear environmental factors that influence your sexual orientation. And there's been a lot of research into possible biological components of sexual orientation, like genetics, brain anatomy, prenatal conditions, or other things. It's also important to know that we're far from understanding sexual orientation on a purely biological level. If anything, the evidence we've got simply strengthens the idea that sexual orientation isn't a choice, but rather a naturally varying occurrence among human beings, like height. So, after all this talk about sex, perhaps you're wondering why we do it at all. I mean, it feels good, obviously, but the biggest function of sex goes beyond pure pleasure. In fact, sexual intimacy serves many of life's most basic purposes, sometimes procreation, but also stress reduction, maintaining healthy relationships, social bonding, and the expression of love and overall fulfillment. People say the brain is the most significant sex organ for a reason, and intimacy is often its own reward. Today, you learned about Alfred Kinsey's groundbreaking sex surveys, the differences between how we define biological sex and gender identity, and about Masters and Johnson's 4-part sexual response cycle. We also looked at the role of sex hormones in our development and drive, how psychological and social factors play into sex, how we think about sexual orientation, and why we have sex in the first place. Thanks for watching, especially to our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course possible. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to subbable.com/Crash Course. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, our sound designer is Michael Ronda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, really good video that's kind of an overview of a bunch of things that we are going to cover in this next section. The only thing I'll say is some of the things that he says I actually disagree with based on the science. Like one of the things he said is that there is nothing after you're born that can change sexual orientation. That is not correct. The science now shows that there are biological things that can happen, there are environmental things that can occur that can shape sexual orientation. It is why twins that have the same hormones in the womb have the same genetics. One of them can be gay and one of them can be straight. It's because of things that happen in the environment after. As we have talked about in this class, just about everything is a mix of genes and environment. Some of the environment's in the womb, but some of the environment does happen after. There is a link. It is not the only link, and it is a weak link, but there is a link between childhood sexual abuse and sexual orientation. Like I said, it is a weak link. That is one of the factors, though, of many now when we look at sexual orientation, that we'll talk about in just a little bit, but one of the many, many factors of sexual orientation that does shape sexual orientation. One of the many environmental and genetic factors that does shape sexual orientation. There are some really strong genetic factors, though. And I would never say even remotely that sexual orientation is a choice. It is a combination, though, of the biological and the environmental factors that result in the outcome, just like everything else in developmental psych. Okay, so sex and gender, got to differentiate it here. It was talked about in the video, but the difference is biological sex is going to be physical characteristics, but not just the physical characteristics that define male and female, but the biological XX or XY. So when I use the term biological sex, I am referring to if the person is XX or XY. And this is the typical development. There are other cases, XXY, Fragile X, 1X, androgen insensitivity syndrome. I could go on and on and on about the things that can get us away from XX and XY. However, when we are talking in this, we are talking of the normal developmental XX and XY for biological sex. Gender, conversely, is the features that society associates with appropriate for men and women. And virtually all societies expect the two sexes to take on different gender roles. Each society's norms generate what's referred to as gender stereotypes. So that's based on the gender roles in that society. And gender norms and stereotypes affect how we perceive ourselves and other people. So gender is not biological sex. Gender, and many people do fall under the same gender as their biological sex, but many people don't as well. So it's not something that we shouldn't confuse the two. When I'm talking about sex differences in here, I'm talking about biological sex. I am not talking about gender differences. Let's look at those gender roles and stereotypes a little bit more. That is that in most societies, in many societies, women's role of nurturer and childbearer shape their gender roles. This is based on evolutionary history. So throughout evolutionary history, women's role was typically that of a childbearer. As a result, they were then responsible for raising the children, nurturing the children. In hunter-gatherer societies, they became gatherers because they had to stay closer to the children. And a lot of our gender role norms that we even have today that have been basically come from this are from basically this nurturer or childbearer role. And at the heart of this is communality, and this is an orientation that emphasizes connectedness to others, including traits of emotionality and sensitive to others. So again, this is traditional roles. It isn't necessarily the role we have now, but a lot of our gender roles and stereotypes are based on this tradition or history of women being nurturers and childbearers and men being agents. So it's the central role of the male gender is agency, orientation towards individual action and achievement. So in the hunter-gatherer societies, it was about being a hunter and going out and basically getting resources, a resource getter. And again, modern times are different, but a lot of the things we've got even boiled down to now go back to the history of this. Let's look at some sex differences and similarities. And if you're looking at your slides, when you go to look back at it, it says gender at the top. That's because, again, even though I strongly emphasize this difference between sex and gender, it's really hard to get out of the same old ruts of using them interchangeably. They are not interchangeable, but a lot of people have used them interchangeably. And when you read things, they're used interchangeably. So it's just one of those where it's hard to get out of. So these are sex differences. These are sex differences based on, again, XX and XY. First, females sometimes display greater verbal abilities and greater memory. In certain domains of verbal ability and certain domains of memory, females tend to be better. Again, many of these sex differences are small, though. Females tend to be more tactful, cooperative, compliant, and empathetic. This could be genetic. This could be environmental, but there is believed to be a genetic component going into this. Females are more prone to anxiety disorders, depression, and phobia. I'll talk about the ones males are more vulnerable to in just a minute, but when it comes to anxiety, depression, and phobias, more females suffer from these than males. Males are better on many tests of spatial ability. There is one main exception. Spatial ability in a smaller sense. So what they did is they took people and it was men and women, and they went to a flea market. They had to wander around the flea market, look at the stalls. Then they took them back to a certain place in the flea market, and they asked people, okay, where was this stall? And they had to point at it. Women were better at that than men were, and that again is a type of spatial ability because they're mentally representing where things are. So when it comes to, and this goes back to evolutionary history, women were more likely to be gatherers. Gatherers is in that more localized type thing, and being able to find where those sources were for gathering would have been important. So over long distances, like you're hunting, going over long distances, men are better. Over shorter distances, especially when food is involved, women are better. Males tend to engage in more physical and verbal aggression and are more physically active, whereas women are more relationally aggressive instead of more physical aggression. They tend to put people down more, especially rivals. Males are more likely to develop antisocial personality disorder and to abuse drugs and alcohol. So again, there's some of the negatives on both sides. However, when it comes to math tests, men and women do equally. Females and males do equally. So it's not something that the stereotype or the myth that men are better at math is just that, a myth. On standardized math tests, when you get rid of stereotype threat and all of that, tend to be no differences. Next, let's talk about androgyny. So androgyny is defined as showing characteristics of both genders. And in the U.S., children of each successive generation have become more androgynous. Androgyny is a good thing. We are becoming more alike. Men are displaying characteristics that are classically categorized as female, and women are showing characteristics that are classically defined as male. So these gender stereotypes are blurring. The lines are getting smaller. So like you see here, we've got Arya and Bieber, or the one on the left, Arya from Game of Thrones, which was a girl pretending to be a boy, and Bieber on the right, which is a boy pretending to be a musician. You thought I was going to say girl. No, he was never, neither of these were pretending to be the opposite, though Arya was kind of trying to disguise herself as. But the point is that there is more and more androgyny going on, where these these gender stereotypes are merging. However, that being said, we're not there yet, because you look at Bieber now and you see what Bieber looks like now, and he's very much gone in the opposite direction. He intentionally has facial hair now. He has a lot of tattoos. He likes to go shirtless, exposes muscles, things like that. And the reasoning for this is believed to be a pushback in the opposite direction. He got made fun of a lot for being too feminine, and unfortunately that's still a way we categorize it. It's still the way society looks at it. He got accused of being too feminine, so he's gone back, some would say overdoing it in the opposite direction of masculinity, so that he is now kind of trying to make up for that. That being said, even with that, in general, people are becoming more androgynous. Let's look at some real quick theories on gender role development. So since we're talking about development and of gender, we have to look at things like the biosocial theory. The biosocial theory basically states that once a biological male or female is born, they become labeled. They start to get socially labeled. They get treated differently. And basically, based on their biological factors, it steers their development. So this social labeling and differential treatment shapes their development along the lines of their biology. And I could show you this, talk about this in Human Sexuality, how much labeling differences occur. I'm not going to go into that too much here, but it basically comes down to things like when you look at words used to describe children, and boys are described as strong and big, girls are described as gentle and delicate, and these are 1 week old babies. There's no difference between males and female babies at 1 week old, but they're described different. And it goes on from there, even into early toddlerhood and childhood. So parents of boys and girls are shown a video of a child playing, and that this child that's playing is doing some things like playing on a playground, stuff like that, and they're doing some things that might even be a little bit risky, and they're asked to stop the video when they would stop their child from doing what's being done. And parents of girls stop their video. Almost all of them stop their video before any of the parents of boys stop their video, because girls are delicate, they're gentle, they're fragile. They can't be playing around on monkey bars and swinging around on things and all that. Whereas boys, they're encouraged to be more physical and more play harder, things like that. So it's just one of those, there's differential treatment. Then at puberty, the biological factors, though, become much more prevalent. So it's no longer the social factors that are coming in at puberty. At puberty, it's the biological factors that are the strongest influencer, because there's large quantities of hormones being released into the bodies. So it's stimulating the growth of the reproductive system and the appearance of the secondary sex characteristics. Breasts are beginning to grow, facial hair, different hips are widening, shoulders are widening, voices are changing. All of this is the differential that's changing at puberty. And these events, added to a person's earlier self-concept as male or female, provide the basis for adult gender identity and role behavior. That being said, there's various different things that can shift it in other directions. So it's not a fixed thing. There are biological factors that can shift it, and there are social and environmental factors that can shift it. So according to social learning theorists, children learn their gender identity, preferences, and behaviors through differential reinforcement, where the parents treat them different, society treats them different, they're punished for behaviors considered not appropriate for their gender, and they're rewarded for behaviors that are appropriate for their gender. Observational learning is where where children learn to adopt the attitudes and behaviors associated with their same-sex models. So children who identify early on as male or female model after those adults that are male or female. However, the cognitive theory of gender typing basically states that children must acquire certain understandings about a gender before they can be influenced by it. So, and children engage in self-socialization where they actively socialize themselves rather than being passive targets. We'll say to this, on one hand, children, even before they understand gender, start showing gender stereotypical behaviors. So the cognitive theory is not 100% accurate there. However, after they understand gender, they tend to become more fixated on those gender stereotypes or more associated with it. However, that being said, the second part has a lot of evidence, and that is children don't just get socialized to be something. They don't, you treat boys like boys, girls like girls. That isn't everything. They self-socialize as well. They actively seek out basically things that confirm the way they feel internally and avoid things that disconfirm with how they feel internally. So this is where you can start to get a gender identity forming even early on in childhood through this self-socialization. So we talked about schemas before. Schemas are basically a model for doing things. So gender schema theory is how individual schemas become associated with gender. And these become formed based on family, early life interactions, the media. All of these basically compile together in our minds as we grow up to associate or become associated with what we identify as gender. And these, we use confirmation bias in this as we start to form our gender. Confirmation bias is where you tend to pay attention to things that confirm our beliefs and ignore things that disconfirm it. And I was talking about this on the previous slide with cognitive. These early on gender type identity things and gender schemas get reinforced with confirmation bias. And then once you form your gender identity, your gender schema theory has a strong influence on that. It's basically your gender identity is shaped by your gender schema theory. Let's watch another video.
Hi everyone, an animated Stephanie here, ready to talk to you all about gender schema theory. As you can see from this week's topic, this theory falls under the category of individual and group differences. Within this very broad subject, gender schema theory focuses on how gender differences come to be and how a person becomes gendered in society. So before getting into more details about this theory, let's first take a look at what the word schema means in the field of psychology. So from Piaget, we learned that a schema is a group of related ideas or actions. So take a second and think of an egg. I know it's a really weird example, but just go with it. Look at all the network of associations or set of interrelated ideas that come up in relation to an egg. Now imagine a similar organization system or framework in your brain. When you think of a certain concept, your brain activates a schema and unconsciously brings up all of this other information that is linked and associated to this concept, like the different colors, uses, and origins of eggs. One person has a whole lot of schemas for a variety of concepts, as you can see in this really complicated map. These schemas, or knowledge structures, act like channels or filters that process new information, and they guide you in paying attention to things that fit into your schema, and then you tend to ignore or explain away things that don't fit in. So now let's get to what a gender schema is. Think of the concept of man, and there's Channing Tatum, just so you can bring that up to mind. What are some of the associations that come into your head? A few that pop into mind are now popping up onto the screen, as you can see. And in adding these words, what I'm doing is actually creating a gender schema. So this is what pops into my head. These are all of the cognitive structures that are activated by the brain at thought of male or female. So, a set of all the stereotypical associations that come up when you envision a man or a woman. Someone with a strong gender schema will impulsively categorize new information in relation to gender, as opposed to any other notion, such as ethnicity or age. In effect, they will sort people, characteristics, and behaviors into masculine and feminine categories. So, for example, a gender schematic person will see a young girl, as you can see in the picture, who constantly hugs and kisses her parents, and they will associate her affectionate behavior to her female gender and not maybe just her young age. So yeah, she's just acting like a girl, hugging and kissing people. Since this gender schema theory guides their perception, a gender schematic will more likely notice things that are consistent with their gender norms. They will see strong, brave men and ignore those that are more soft and delicate in manner. Moreover, these gender schemas become internalized and are used to process information about the self. From the gender schema, a person learns which attributes are to be linked with their own sex, and hence with themselves. However, it's important to remember that people vary in the degree to which they are gender schematic. So, how are these gender schemas formed? Let's take a look at that for a while. From a young age, children are taught the many sex-related associations that form the basis of a gender schema. These lessons can come from a number of environmental cues, such as what they are told by their parents, how they see other people behaving in real life, advertisements they see on TV or billboards, movies, and the media. Gender schema theory relies on the assumption that children learn what it means to be male and female by observing the world around them. After they make these observations, they modify their behaviors to fit into what is normal and expected by the culture that surrounds them. So now let's take a look at an example of gender schema theory at work. A little boy watches his dad do all the repairs around the house. He observes his dad using tools to fix the sink, build an extra room, and paint the walls. Over time, the connection between his dad and construction becomes part of his schema. Then he begins to associate this schema with his own self-concept and gender. Since he is a boy too, he will be interested in tools, building, and construction. Eventually, he will even come to consider these behaviors masculine. So now that we're all gender schema theorists, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do in the classroom with this information? We can use this theory to understand student behavior in the classroom. So Jason's disruptive behavior during individual reading time may be due to a gender schema that associates this quiet, passive activity with how girls should behave. Or Jessica's lack of effort in math class may stem from a gender schema that places math skills under the male category. So it's up to us teachers to modify our lessons in such a way that we promote gender equality and make sure we break down gender stereotypes. We should take the time to focus away from splitting things along gendered lines. So, for example, try not to call your class back in order by saying, "Hey, boys and girls, listen up." This just emphasizes the separation between the girls in the room and the boys in the room. Don't use math problems that ask students to calculate how many dishes a woman washed or how fast a man was racing a car down along the track. So avoid gender stereotypes. And you can show Jessica's class some of the famous women that have contributed to the world of mathematics. And for Jason, you can invite a male author to your class to read from one of the books he has written. And that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. And yeah, that's it. That's gender schema in a nutshell. So thank you for listening.
Okay, so let's look at this throughout the lifespan real quick. I know again, we're focusing on adolescence here, but let's look at just a couple slides real quick of infant childhood treatment. So first, differences between males and females at birth are small and inconsistent. I already said that there's virtually no difference between males and females at birth. However, soon after birth, they begin to get differential treatment. Boys are described in masculine terms. Girls are described in feminine terms, soft, cuddly, adorable, that type of thing. Their clothing, their hairstyles, their toys, their room furnishings tend to be gender specific. So the socialization does happen from an early age. As far as early learning, infants pretty early on learn to categorize males and females, at least the differences between them, and they start to associate themselves with the social category to which they belong. By 18 months, most toddlers seem to have emerging understanding of that they are like or not like males or females. So by 18 months, there tends to be a start forming of a gender identity. And at this point, almost all follow the gender of their biological sex. 2.5 to 3 years old, most children can give verbal proof that they've formed a gender identity, and boys and girls begin to demonstrate preferences for gender-appropriate activities and toys. And again, there's more androgyny going on now, so it isn't as strong or as of a difference as it used to be. But for the most part, there is this formation of gender identity and gender-appropriate activities and toys that are done by 3 years old. And about this time, children prefer same-sex playmates. Before this, there isn't a preference, but about 2.5 to 3 years old, they start to prefer same-sex playmates. In childhood, a strong sense of gender identity is formed, and there tends to be gender constancy going on at this point in time, where the gender identity you form tends to stay the same, as well as following the constants of the gender that you are adhering to, so of the societal. During this time, the gender role stereotypes are being formed, and standards for dress and behavior are important. So important and emphasized. This is about the time where some people that end up having gender dysphoria, for some people who have gender identity disorder, where they feel that they are a different gender than their biological sex. This is where a lot of them it starts showing up, is in childhood. Not all, but in not every child who has a gender identity issue ends up becoming trans. But this is a point where you do see many changes occurring. Let's watch another short video.
School years, children have a strong sense of gender identity and gender role expectations. Most 2-year-olds know with certainty whether they are male or female, and by the age of 4 or 5 begin not only to develop gender constancy, but often show rigid standards for what they believe is appropriate male and female dress and behavior.
Can boys put on dresses? Do girls have short hair or long hair?
Long hair.
Are you a boy or a girl?
A boy.
Are you ever going to be a girl?
No.
What are boys like?
I don't know.
Are they different than girls? How are they different than girls?
Because they don't put stuff like girls on.
Boys don't put on girls' clothes?
No.
Can girls put on boys' clothes?
No.
Alexis, are you a boy or a girl?
A girl.
Are you ever going to be a boy?
Mm-mm.
Are you a boy or a girl?
Boy.
Are you ever going to be a girl?
No. Boys are better than girls.
Why?
Because boys are stronger than the girls sometimes.
What would happen if you put on a dress?
All the girls and all the boys will laugh at me. I won't look like a boy, that one will look like a girl.
Would it be okay?
No way.
Young children appear to begin to acquire gender role stereotypes at about the same time that they develop gender identity. And by the age of 3 or 4, most children, when asked questions about the activities appropriate for a male doll and a female doll, readily give stereotypic responses.
Which doll likes to clean the house?
This one.
Who takes care of the babies?
That's fine.
Who goes to work?
This one.
So a really interesting little video there. I know that was again about children and we're supposed to be in the adolescent chapter, but it is important. So let's transition into adolescence then, and we'll look at adolescence and sexual identity. So in adolescence, there tends to be a stronger adhering to gender roles. And adolescents experience what's referred to as a gender intensification. During this time, gender roles become more important. This is due to things like puberty and all of that. However, that being said, there is a shift in society going on where it's less of a concern than at least it used to be. But this gender intensification still goes on. Boys tend to see themselves as more masculine and girls begin to emphasize their femininity. And the stereotypic thinking about gender roles and intolerance of gender role violations increases during this time. There is more androgyny now, but even then, the androgyny does tend to lessen somewhat during adolescence. Now, we're not going to talk about adulthood and through the lifespan, but just point out that the gender intensification does tend to increase as people get into adult relationships, adult romantic relationships, but then over time it does decrease after that. Let's transition to sexual identity for the end here. Just a little bit of this. Sexual identity, it's something that's sexual orientation. It's usually formed in adolescence, though it can start earlier. Some people say they had a sense of who they were attracted to as young as 4 or 5. And we do know that attractions, not sexual attractions, but attractions can start to form very early in life. So at 4 or 5, it's not unusual to have attractions. It's unusual to have sexual attractions, but it's not unusual to have more of almost like a romantic type attraction. There is a biological and a social basis of sexual orientation. I said this in the video earlier, so I'm not going to rehash it now. Just note that we do know a bunch of things that go into the biology of sexual orientation now. We're learning more every year, but we also know the social, the societal, the environmental effects, and some of those that do have an effect. Let's watch another really short video.
Everyone goes through a period of figuring out who they're attracted to and who is attracted to them. Sexual identity involves figuring out who we are sexually, what we like and don't like, and who we're attracted to. Recent surveys of American teens have reported that around 88% of teenagers describe themselves as predominantly heterosexual. About 1 to 2% of teens describe themselves as predominantly homosexual or bisexual. And about 10% of teens describe themselves as being confused about their sexual orientation. Now, the formation of your identity also revolves around experimenting and trying other adult-type behaviors, such as drinking alcohol or doing drugs. As the psychologist Erik Erikson put it, being a teen involves forming our identity in at least 3 main areas: sexual, ideological, and occupational. We form our identity through our relationships, that's the sexual part, our political and religious beliefs, that's the ideological part, and through career choices, that's the occupational part. To put it simply, being a teenager means trying to figure out who we like, what we believe, and what career is best suited for us.
All right, like I said, really short. Okay, so let's look at the development of sexual orientation. It basically, for adolescents who are attracted to members of their own sex, the process of accepting sexual orientation and establishing a positive identity can be difficult. It's becoming easier. So when I first made these slides, when I first gave this lecture, it was still most places illegal for people that were gay to get married. And a lot has changed. A lot of acceptance just in the last 10 years has occurred. Doesn't mean we're where we need to be. Of course, there needs to be more, but there is a lot more acceptance now than there used to be. As I said before, many have initial awareness of sexual preference long before puberty, but at the same time, some don't even accept being gay or lesbian or able to tell others until their mid-20s or later. All you have to do is look at The Bachelor. I don't know if any of you watch The Bachelor, but if you watch The Bachelor, Colton was The Bachelor. He was on The Bachelor at first, then he was on The Bachelor, and he was The Bachelor, and he was a NFL football player, past football player, and he was also a virgin. And there was a lot of speculation that people had that he was actually gay. Well, just earlier this year, he came out as gay. And it's something he had struggled with for many, many years. So for some people, this is a easy thing. For some people, and relatively easy. They know from an early age, there's no question in their mind. I grew up with a guy that was a friend of mine, and he knew since he was like 5 that he was gay. There was never a question in anybody's mind about him being gay. When he got to adolescence, he came out to everyone, but everyone already knew. It wasn't a question. Whereas others, they might get into their even 40s or 50s and really have repressed it or just not fully accepted it or aware of it. So it is something that is different from individual to individual. So, as I said, there are various different factors. There are definitely genetic factors. We have found many genetic factors now that are links for homosexuality. If I was doing my human sexuality lecture, I would go into all the different non-human animals that show homosexuality, and there are literally thousands of non-human animal species that have homosexuality in them. But there are genetic factors. There have been genetic factors that have been identified. Identical twins are more alike in sexual orientation than fraternal twins. However, there are environmental factors. There are environmental factors. Some of the earliest environmental factors is testosterone in the womb. That is one of the strongest environmental factors we know of that influences it, and that's testosterone in the womb. More testosterone in the womb for male offspring result in less homosexuality. Less testosterone results in more. The opposite is true for females. More testosterone in the womb for female fetuses result in more homosexuality. So I'll ask you to now put your hand down on the table, flat. Put your fingers straight, and compare your pointer finger to your ring finger, your first finger to your third finger, and look at the length of them. In those who had higher testosterone in the womb, the pointer finger will be shorter. Let's see if I can draw down here. You've got your fingers. This is higher T. Higher T, you've got the pointer finger is shorter than the ring finger. With lower T, lower testosterone in the womb, these fingers tend to be the same length. So higher testosterone, the pointer finger's lower. And so most males, most guys, well, most males, most biological males will have hands like this. Most biological females will have hands like this, with the fingers the same. However, some males have it the opposite, and some females have it the opposite. That is due to testosterone in the womb. This is what's referred to as the 2D/4D ratio, and it actually can predict a whole bunch of things in people's lives. One is sexual orientation. It is not a guarantee, but those males who have fingers like this, there is a much higher incidence of homosexuality. Females who have fingers like this, there is a higher incidence of homosexuality. This is again due to testosterone in the womb. Now, interestingly enough, the first time I taught developmental, I was talking about this, and I basically demonstrated this. It was a small summer class. There was, I think, 13 students in the class and only one guy in the entire class. The one guy in the class, he says that his fingers are both the same length. His fingers were like this, like a female. And I said, well, that's fine. Again, just because there's a higher tendency for homosexuality with that doesn't mean that is the guarantee or the end result. And he said, that's okay, I'm gay. So he was gay, and he had fingers that were more like this. I hope I'm not drawing over where I'm going to have the slides come up in just a second. Words come up. But he had fingers more like that. So just a evidence in action where it was like that. It's just one of those things. There are environmental factors. That's in the womb. There's environmental factors after the womb. Many gay men and lesbian women expressed strong cross-sex interest when they were young, even in the face of universal pressures to adopt their traditional gender roles. We do know that abuse is a factor. Nobody wants to admit it. Nobody likes to admit it, but the studies have shown that abuse does relate to sexual orientation. Again, it's not a guarantee, and it's not even actually a strong relationship, but there is a slight relationship between childhood sexual abuse and the gender of the abuser and sexual orientation. Boys who are abused by males have a higher incidence rate of becoming homosexual. Girls that are abused by females have a higher incidence rate of becoming homosexual. So it is just one of those that it's a environmental factor that is shaping thought from a young age. And I already talked about the hormonal influences during the prenatal period, which is this that we were talking about right there. So there's a lot that goes into this, and there's a lot of factors. They've identified dozens of factors now relating to sexual orientation. But here's another factor. Societal norms. What's accepted. So you look at Greek times. So a couple thousand years ago during Greek, there's a lot of evidence of this early in the Roman Empire, the Greek times, that homosexuality and bisexuality were much more rampant. Most people were bisexual. It was commonly accepted. It was the norm at the time for people to be bisexual. So as a result, most people were. It is the norm now for it. It's less accepted. But as it becomes more accepted, more and more people are becoming bisexual or homosexual. Are they becoming that because of this? Because of the norms? I would say it's more of the norms allow them to be more of who they are. The changing norms allow people to express themselves and be who they actually are rather than repressing it. So having a society where it's accepted, allowed, and normal for people to be gay, for people to be bisexual, for people to be trans, means yes, more people will be gay, bi, or trans, but that's only because more people are being themselves. Okay, so in this we talked about sex and gender, we talked about androgyny, theories of gender, gender throughout the lifespan, and finished up with sexual orientation. Thanks, come on back.